All of this raises a lot of concern, Wolf, uh, about the situation that we're dealing with. We're dealing with probably the most serious crisis involving a potential nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's a time, frankly, where we need a president to speak in a steady and calm and stable and responsible way, because the rhetoric that's going on is simply fueling this situation and creating something that concerns me, which is that at some point there is a miscalculation. There's a mistake by someone in North Korea or someone in South Korea or someone elsewhere that suddenly has us into a war on the Korean Peninsula. I really do think that what is required now is a lessening of this rhetoric and allow our actions to speak for the United States, not our words.
Because the president said today that the U.S. military is locked and loaded, ready to go if the North Koreans virtually do anything that the U.S. considers unacceptable. That kind of language, locked and loaded, fire and fury, the president is clearly doubling and tripling down. He's not backing away at all.
No, and I think the concern I have is that that language is backing him into a corner. And the more he talks that way, the deeper he goes into that corner. And it begins to limit the flexibility that he needs if, in fact, we're going to find a way out of this crisis. So I think the important thing right now is to recognize, as we all do, that the United States of America is the most powerful country on the face of the earth. And very frankly, that power says a lot to North Korea and to others around the world. We don't really need to have a president who challenges other countries with words like fire and fury and lock and load. What we need now is a president who can provide some assurance to the American people and to the world that they will do everything necessary to find some kind of peaceful solution to this terrible crisis that we're confronting.
When the Chinese and the Russians say they want to try to ease this crisis, they have some influence, but it would be a good idea, they believe, for the U.S. and South Korea to postpone or cancel their scheduled military exercises this month, something the North Koreans obviously always hate, always respond very negatively to. Do you see any possibility at all of those military exercises being postponed?
Well, I certainly would not recommend that we cancel those exercises, particularly when North Korea is threatening to launch missiles at Guam. And therefore, I think it is important, and I assume this is happening, and that diplomatic channels are being used to try to determine whether or not there is any basis for North Korea and the United States and others to be able to sit down and resolve this peacefully. But until that happens, I would not assume that the United States is going to back away from anything.
The president also differentiated between statements coming from North Korean military generals as opposed to the leader, Kim Jong-un himself. He pointedly said, we haven't heard him say much over these past 3 days. You think he's basically goading Kim Jong-un to speaking out? He says that would presumably be a threat. These other statements are not much threats.
Wolf, I think one of the things we've learned over 60 years in dealing with various North Korean dictators is that you can't out-bully a bully. And the reality is that rather than engaging in this kind of loose talk, which I think very frankly undermines the power and prestige of the United States of America. When this kind of loose talk takes place, the rest of the world is listening and trying to figure out what is going on and what does the United States really stand for. And then the president, in the middle of a press conference, talks about military options in Venezuela, for goodness sakes, raising the prospect that somehow he's thinking about using military force in Venezuela. At some point, the president has to recognize that as commander-in-chief and as a world leader, that he's going to have to speak with some degree of steadiness and responsibility as president of the United States. Because when he uses that kind of loose talk, it really does send mixed signals to the world. And very frankly, it undermines our power in the world.
Let me play that clip, because it really jumped out at me as well, Mr. Secretary, with the U.S. military deeply involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, now a military crisis underway with North Korea. All of a sudden, we heard the president on his own say this. Listen.
I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor. This is, we're all over the world. And we have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away. And the people are suffering. And they're dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military option if necessary.
That would be U.S.-led, President?
Say?
That would be a U.S.-led military operation?
We don't talk about it, but a military operation and military option is certainly something that we could pursue.
That was the first time I heard anyone in the administration, in the government, the military, suggest that the U.S. is considering military action in Venezuela. You're a former defense secretary, former CIA director. Have you heard that in recent weeks?
I have not, and very frankly, considering the number of flashpoints we're dealing with in a very dangerous world, the last thing we need is another flashpoint where we may possibly use a military force. I just think that, and I understand, this is a president who comes out of the development industry in New York City, he comes out of reality TV. I think he kind of prides himself that talking is kind of his business, and talking is the way he appeals to his base. And he's been able to win election as president because of his ability to talk. But when you're president of the United States and when you're commander-in-chief, this is not reality TV. This is a situation where you can't just talk down to everybody in the world and expect that somehow you can bully them to do what you think is right. These are leaders in these countries. They worry about their countries. They worry about what's going to happen. And they take the President of the United States literally. Words count. And I just think that the President needs to understand, and the people around the President need to make clear that when we are facing the kind of crisis we are facing now, this is not a time for loose talk. It's a time for serious strategizing as to what steps we have to take in order to make sure that we find a peaceful solution and not wind up in a nuclear war.
A couple more questions, Mr. Secretary. The president did say